In terms of Magnus, for me, the real question is what exactly was the opening choice. It seemed as though there was really no oomph behind it. It just seemed like he thought he could play any opening and outplay Hans perhaps, or he confused the move order. I mean, we'll probably never know, because I doubt Magnus will do an interview or talk about this game. Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be taking a look at a game that was played in the 4th round of the Sinquefield Cup between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann, the rising American junior player. Now, going into this round, the two players were tied for the lead. Magnus with 1 win and 1 draw. Hans in the same situation, 1 win and 1 draw. So this was a matchup of the leaders, and it was not going to disappoint. So let's jump right into the game. So Magnus, starting with the white pieces, plays d4. We get knight to f6. c4, e6 is played by Hans, and now we get knight c3 and bishop b4. This is a classic Nimzo Indian defense. Now, there are many different setups here for white. White can play e3, f3, knight f3, a3, queen c2, and one of the other setups that white can play is this move pawn to g3. Now, this line has been played quite a bit, but generally it's considered to be fairly stable and not too challenging if black knows how to respond. So we get castles, bishop g2, d5 is played, and here we get the strange move by Magnus, pawn to a3. Now, again, it's hard to judge exactly what Magnus was aiming for in this game. When I did a look through the database of the games that Hans has played over the last couple of years, the only game that I saw with this position after a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3 was played in 2019 against Casa Corley. Now, again, that game was played 3 years ago. That's an eternity, especially in the COVID and post-COVID world that we live in. So it's not something that I think is very reliable. As such, I'm fairly surprised that Magnus played this line, because after d takes c4, knight to f3 and c5, black should be relatively fine according to opening theory. Now, I have one theory about this game which probably is wrong, and that is that I kind of suspect that there is some possibility, no matter how small it is, that Magnus actually just outright confused the move order, and he intended to play knight f3, d takes c4, castles, and now this knight to c6 move, and then a3. Now, this is a line that's been played quite a bit. It's nothing new. There are a lot of games, including one actually, I guess it didn't occur in this line, but this position has been reached in games between, say, Fabiano and Wesley in the US Championship tiebreaker, and other major players have essayed it as well. So as such, I don't really believe that Magnus confused his move order, but that being said, this line is not considered to have too much bite to it. So we get castles here played by Magnus, and now Hans plays pawn takes pawn. Worth noting, even knight c6 is considered fine according to modern day theory. So pawn takes pawn is played. We get queen takes pawn, knight to c6, queen takes c4, and now we get this move pawn to e5 played by Hans. And now we have bishop g5 by Magnus, h6 played instantly by Hans, and we get rook fd1. Now, it's worth noting that during the post-game analysis, Hans claimed that he had looked at this before the game, and all of the stuff with bishop e6 have been played. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical of that claim, because it seems like he wasn't making these moves instantly, and also it's worth noting that this is not something that has been played all that frequently. At any rate, we get h6 being played here, rook fd1, which is a slight mistake here. White probably should trade and play a move like knight d2 with the idea of knight e4 or rook a b1. And after something like queen e7 here, I think that position is pretty balanced. There's really nothing special going on for white. In fact, if anything, you have a slight weakness on c3 here, so it could be a little bit better for black potentially. So after h6, Magnus plays rook fd1. Hans plays this move bishop to e6. Very good move, by the way, because after queen to e7, for example, you can take and play knight d2, and now with this extra tempo with the rook on d1 versus f1, after queen e7, knight e4, now the knight is immediately jumping to this d6 square, and there will be problems for black along this diagonal from g2 to a8. Hans, however, plays bishop e6, the best move here, and now rook takes d8 is played, bishop c4, there's a swap of rooks, bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and now we get king f1. Now, one reason I'm very surprised by this whole opening choice from Magnus is that in such a position, it's very hard for white to create much of an imbalance. If anybody is better here, it probably should be black, even though he has the double pawns on f7 and f6, because his pawn on c3 will become a weakness down the road after rook c8 and knight a5. So I assess these two split pawns on a3 and c3 to be weaker than the compromised pawn structure that black has on the king side with f7 and f6. As such, that's why I'm really confused by this whole opening choice and what exactly Magnus was hoping to achieve from it, because even though he is an endgame wizard, there isn't enough here to where I think that white can be better. If anything, I actually prefer to be black. So after king f1, we get rook d8. Now king e1 is played by Magnus. We get knight to a5 being played here. Rook d1, not knight d2, by the way, because this would lose to rook takes knight. king takes rook, knight to b3, and after you move the king, I take king b2, I go back to b3, and I simply have an extra knight on the board. So after knight a5 is played here, we get rook d1. Hans correctly keeps the rooks on the board. Now you could trade the rooks, but after trading the rooks, you'll notice that these pawns on c3 and a3 are not all that weak anymore. White can just move the king up. So for example, let's just get some position like this where the king is on c2. You can't really target these pawns on c3 and a3 anymore. So when we look at the basic themes, it's more important to keep the rook on the board, because with the rook you can target the pawn. Additionally, if I just make some moves for illustration, you get this position where the pawn is weak and you go king d2. There's now knight c4 with the fork, and you will capture the pawn in e3. So after rook c8, knight d2 is played by Magnus. We get bishop e6, and now we get a move that's maybe a little bit surprising from a human perspective. I understand why it's played. The computer actually wanted white to play this unusual looking move, knight to e4, and if black plays f5, you can go knight to d6, rook takes c3, and there's a very weird idea with bishop h3 to go after this double f pawn, and the computer actually thinks that white should be okay here. Now again, it's not super intuitive, it doesn't feel very human, so it's really hard to criticize Magnus for this, but the computer does like this idea. Whereas Magnus plays c4, giving up a pawn here and trusting that he's going to be getting enough counterplay after bishop takes pawn, knight takes, rook takes, there's check, and then bishop d5 here. White has a very nice wooden shield. This bishop on d5 is covering all the squares. The knight on a5 is also a little bit out of play here, and if white has the opportunity, say rook c2 is played, after rook d7, white will go after this pawn on f7 as well as the pawn on b7, and white is probably going to win the game. So Hans correctly plays this move rook to c7 here, preventing rook d7 and controlling the 7th rank, and now white is just simply down a pawn. So we get rook a8, a6 is played. It's worth noting here, however, that this knight is stuck on the rim, and you can bring it back, but all these endgames are going to be very hard to win, because after takes on something like rook b8, rook c7, a4, black's extra pawn, it is a doubled f pawn here, so even though black is much better, it's going to be very hard to win, so there are technical issues. So we get rook b8 being played here, f5 played by Hans. Now this is a very nice idea that it's quite simple. In fact, black wants to go e4, pawn on f5 will support it, and then run the king to the center of the board very quickly with king f6 and king e5. So if I play like king f1, and just to illustrate the point, get king e5, white's bishop on d5 is really not stable here anymore. Knight guards the pawn, and if you ever have to move the bishop back to a2, I think black can maybe even just run the king all the way in here. Maybe that's too much, but it is very, very scary for white to play. So I really do like this f5 move, and around here Magnus starts to lose the thread. He plays this move rook to e8, which is an okay move. There's nothing wrong with this, but the computer actually would have preferred rook d8, and the reason is quite simple. Again, the rook cannot move from the 7th rank because of rook d7, and if black ever moves the knight back to the center, you will trade into this endgame. And again, black is better, extra pawn, but it should be a draw with correct play. Instead, Magnus plays rook to e8. Now we get this move pawn to e4. Of course, if black were to play king f6, white goes rook h8, targeting the pawn on h6. Now you have to go back, and then I go back to e8. So e4 is a very logical move. And now we get g4 being played here by Magnus. This is the first, I would say, surprising move in this endgame. Now it is much better for black here. It feels very unpleasant for white to play. That being said, f3 is, I think, a more human move and much more logical, because after pawn takes, bishop takes, black has these double f pawns, which are very, very weak, and after knight c4, a4, it feels like white still has reasonable drawing chances here due to these weaknesses. At any rate, Magnus plays g4. We get this move rook to c5 here, bishop to a2, and now we have the one of the fateful moments of the game after this move, knight to c4. Now knight c4 is a move that after the game Hans thought was very logical, very principled. The computer hates this move because it says that after bishop takes, rook takes, pawn, rook a4, black will be getting the two connected pawns, and as a human you assume this is probably winning, or at the very least quite dangerous. However, the computer proves that after rook b8, b5, you go rook b6 here. Important move for two reasons. First of all, black can no longer push the pawns up the board because you will lose one of the pawns. Secondly, you stop the king from getting to f6 and e5. And in this line after b5, rook b6, rook a3, king d2, h5, h4 is played. It would appear that white has pretty good drawing chances here. If black goes rook a4, trying to escort the pawns after king e3, b4 takes, a5, king e5. White is getting a lot of counterplay here with like rook a2, e4, rook takes f2, rook b5, and now you have to go back to a2 to guard the pawns. And now after rook to b8, there are ideas like f6 here with rook f8 or rook g8. And it's, again, very hard to see from a distance, so you can't really be critical, but this should be a draw with correct play. At any rate, Magnus does not do this. Instead, he plays a4, which essentially loses the game on the spot due to a very nice tactic. Now, I don't know whether Magnus at this point was already just very rattled and unsure of himself in terms of what he was doing, but after this move he overlooks a nasty little tactic. So we get a4, knight to d6 is played by Hans, we get rook to e7. Now again, the initial idea I assume for Magnus was to play rook d8 here, and as well, the knight's under attack. If you go back after pawn takes, knight takes, rook d7, white's completely fine, both pawns are under attack. If knight d6, there's bishop d5, and just like that, white will win the game. So you assume that after rook d8, white's completely fine. However, and I suspect this is what Magnus missed in the game, is there's this very nasty move, pawn to e3, because now if you take the knight on d6, I have rook c1 check, rook d1, we trade, and then I take on f2, and you cannot stop this pawn from going to f1 and becoming a queen, and you lose the game. So if you take the pawn on e3, which is a natural reaction, now there's knight to e4, and again, you have this big problem with this checkmate on, or I guess it's not actually checkmate, but this threat of rook to c1. So for example, if you take on f5, I go check, king has no squares here, you have to go rook d1, and after takes knight c3, king c2, knight takes a2. If you go to b3, the knight gets out via c1, e2, and g1, and if you go to b2 here, the knight gets out via b4 and c6. So either way, the knight is on the loose. As such, Magnus, I think, realizing this issue during the game, plays this move, rook to e7. We get pawn takes pawn. Black now has 2 extra pawns. Rook d7 is played. Hans correctly spots e3. Pawn takes pawn is played. Knight to e4, again threatening rook c1, so he goes king f1. And now you'll notice one big transformation, which is if we go back to, let's just go back to this position in the game, all the way back here, white is down a pawn, but black's extra pawn is a doubled f pawn, and white's pawn structure is completely intact. But as we scoot ahead to this position after e3, knight e4, suddenly you'll notice that black still retains a 1 pawn advantage, and additionally white's pawn structure is now compromised. So it's a dream situation because you still keep the pawn and your pawn structure is great, and now white has double pawns as well. So technically this is very close to lost. So we get king f1, rook to c1 is played, king g2, rook c2. Now this is a slight mistake by Hans. Again, what I would say is when we're looking at this with computers, it's much easier to spot the moves like rook f5 and then I guess b6 or b5. Both moves are technically winning according to the computer, but for us humans, it's not obvious whatsoever. So we get rook c1, king g2, rook c2. Magnus takes the pawn on f7. Hans captures, and now we get king g1 and a little bit of a repetition here. Hans repeats, and now he goes king to f6. Of course, he does not want to take a draw with rook e1. Black is still up a pawn here, but more importantly, white's king is very passive. It's cut off, it's on the back rank, and there are not many squares to go to. So after king f6, Hans sidesteps any kind of weird discovered attacks like bishop c4, bishop d5, winning the knight or the rook. Bishop d5 is played here, and this is really the fateful blunder. The computer actually says that after rook takes b7, if black plays knight g5 here, there's a stunning line with bishop h5, which saves as a draw, because after knight f3, king f1, if black takes, you simply capture on g4, and if black plays rook to a2, there's another unbelievable move here, which is pawn to h4, saving the day, because now black can't play en passant because you lose the knight, and additionally, if you capture h4, you lose g4, and any trade here where the h and g pawn come off the board will lead to a draw. So this is actually a line that would have saved the day. Almost impossible, I think, to spot this idea of h4. If you play even h3, for example, after knight h2, king g1, g takes h3, black is going to win again. So it's literally only this h4 move that saves the day, and again, for a computer, it might be easy. For us humans, very difficult. Instead, Magnus plays bishop d5, and the reason that this is, I don't want to say so bad, but the reason that this is actually so bad is it forces a situation where we reach a bishop versus knight endgame where there are no real chances for white to save it. We get rook d2, rook f7, king g6 is played, rook d7. Actually, to be fair, I did misspeak. There is rook to f4 here, but there are a couple ways that black can play. First of all, I think he can take, and after rook e4, h5 here, I think black is probably winning because the rook is really good on d5. So we get king f2, b5, takes king e2, king g5. Black should be winning because first of all, the rook cuts off the king, so the pawn can be scored down the board. Secondly, the rook guards all the pawns, so white, even if white goes rook b4, it's still guarded. And they're also the third problem that after king g5, black is threatening to go king h4, king h3, and just gobble the pawn on h2. So I think this is probably losing. I'm not 100% sure, but the other possibility, which Hans actually pointed out in his post-game interview, was that you can play knight g5, and after bishop g2, his idea was to go king h5. Computer for some reason says that after rook b4, king h4, rook takes b7, h5, some e4 move, white might, I guess, be able to save the game, but still feels very random, and very unlike a human. It's just a very computerish sort of line, so can't fault Magnus for this. Instead he plays rook d7. Knight g5 is played, a key move by the way, because initially as you look at the position you might think, well, okay, if king f5 is played, you take with check and win the rook. If you go king g5 here, I just check again, and now after king f6 rook f7 we're right back where we started. And if you go king f5 here, I just take and take on g4 and it should be a draw. And so you can't go to g5 or f5. You go to f6, I go back to f7 and we have a draw by threefold. So here knight g5 is an excellent move, because now if white tries to come up with a discovery, say bishop e4, you just capture and guard the rook. And when bishop f7 is played in the game here, Hans actually makes a mistake here. He plays king f5. King f6 would have won the game on the spot, because after rook takes rook, there's knight f3, king f2, knight takes rook. Let's say bishop d5. You can simply go b5 here, and after takes king e2, you just go knight c4, knight d6, and with this passed pawn you should be able to go h5 h4 and create the wide peepos. This would be a quite straightforward technical win. Again, can't really be critical, but this would have ended the game on the spot. Whereas after king f5, white can at least hope for a little bit of miracle, because after rook takes rook, knight f3, king g2, knight takes rook, there's now a5. And unlike in the other variation, because the king is on f5 here versus f6, you can't capture. Just to show you guys the illustration, if you try a5 here, you simply lose the bishop. So that's why king f5 is a slight mistake, because at least here after a5, if white can get bishop d5 and target these two light square pawns, there are chances to save the game. Whereas in the other line, you're ending up with just a clean pass pawn on the b file. So that's why king f6 was a better option. At any rate, it is still winning. You just have to be a little bit precise. So Hans plays king e5, important move because it stops bishop d5. If you play, say, a move like let's just say knight f3, there's bishop d5, and now you're going to lose both the pawns on b7 and a6, and the game will end in a draw. So king e5 prevents bishop d5. Magnus plays king g3, knight f1, again another perfect move. We get king f2 here. It's worth noting king g4 is probably the best move for the computer, but at this point it makes no difference, because you capture the pawn in h2, and after a move like king h5 here, you go knight f1, king takes pawn, knight takes e3, and after king g6, black's knight is simply too quick getting to the queen side. King d4, king f6, and now this great move, knight to c4. If you trade, black's king gets over, captures the pawn, and you have two pawns to march up the board. And if you don't trade and you play a move like king e7, after knight takes a5, king d7, many ways for black to win, but simplest would be b5, king c7, and now let's move king to c5, preventing either king b6 or king b7. Both the squares are covered, and now you can just push the b pawn all the way up the board, and this would be very straightforward. So Magnus plays king f2, hoping for a little bit of a trick, because after knight takes h2, he plays this move pawn to e4. Now the idea is quite simple. He wants to go bishop d5 and win the pawns on b7 and a6. Now there are many ways to win besides what happens in the game, but it is worth pointing out that even something like h5 should be enough to, maybe h5 not specifically, but king f4 here, even this line I believe should be enough with g3 and then knight g4, but there's no need for that. We get king takes e4, and now Hans is up 3 pawns here. But Magnus has one last trick here with bishop e6, because again, he's not too worried about these two pawns if he can win these two pawns on b7 and a6 here. So we get king f4 here, bishop c8, trying to go after both of these pawns. Hans plays the move knight to f3, bishop takes pawn, knight to e5, bishop takes pawn, and now he goes knight c6, correctly understanding that since all the pawns are coming off on the queen side, black will simply have 2 extra pawns on the king side, and that's more than enough to win the game. So we get bishop b7, knight takes a5, bishop d5, trying to dominate this knight. The knight actually has no squares at the moment to jump to, because the bishop will capture no matter where you go. However, with the 2 pawns, white will eventually have to yield and move the bishop. So we get h5, bishop f7, h4, bishop d5, and now we get this critical king e5 move. And here Magnus resigns in view of the fact there's no square for the bishop to move to where you can target the pawn. Say for example, you could just put the bishop here and target the pawn, then you would play on. But the problem is all the squares are covered. So if you go bishop f3, for example, black just takes, and after king f5, if you go king g2, king g4, the pawn is supported. I just bring the knight over and win the game quite simplistically. And if you move the bishop to any other square, say a2 even, now I'm able to bring the knight back, and after king f4 followed by knight e5 and h3 g3, this would be a very, very straightforward win. So Magnus ends up resigning this game after king e5. Hans has a huge win here in this 3rd round game, and it's a very impressive victory. I think my general takeaway is Hans, once he got the advantage, he kept playing relatively good moves. I think computer, of course, saw chances for both sides at various moments, but overall it felt like a pretty clean game. So for Hans, I think he should be very, very proud. It was a very good game, a very good victory. In terms of Magnus, for me, the real question is what exactly was the opening choice. It seemed as though there was really no oomph behind it. It just seemed like he thought he could play any opening and outplay Hans, perhaps. Or he confused the move order. I mean, we'll probably never know, because I doubt Magnus will do an interview or talk about this game in the future. But at any rate, rather peculiar for me, having seen Magnus play so many games over the years in terms of what his thought process was. But at any rate, it's a big win for Hans. He is now half a point ahead of Wesley So, who defeated the struggling Fabiano Caruana as well in the 4th round. There were a lot of other games which were draws, but going into round 4, Hans has a half-point lead over Wesley alone. He will be playing with the black pieces, or sorry, he'll be playing with the white pieces tomorrow against Alireza Firouzja, who bounced back with a huge victory over Levon Aronian today. So it's going to be a very exciting 4th round game, and I'm looking forward to doing a big recap of that game as well for all of you guys who are watching on YouTube. Once again, I hope you guys enjoyed this recap, and if you've not hit that subscribe button already, make sure to click below, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for all the updates, all the recaps, all the great chess stuff that's going on in the world right now. See you guys soon.